Welcome. This presentation is called A Proof that One God Exists, a fact that can be determined by human reason. And we're going to approach this through that which is accessible to us, reality. But what is the truth about all that we perceive around us? We're going to approach this through what I call the tree of reality. And this is a construct that I developed to explain what is called conditioned reality. It's a matter-energy tree, and on the left-hand side we have matter. And we're going to look at iron as an example. Now, iron is what is called a conditioned reality, in that it depends on something more fundamental than itself to fulfill its conditions for existence. Iron exists only because metals exist. Metals in turn exist because the elements exist. The elements exist because atoms exist. Atoms exist because subatomic particles exist. Subatomic particles exist because matter in general exists. Now to the right-hand side, the energy side, we're going to look at gamma rays as an example. Gamma rays exist because photons exist. Photons exist because electromagnetic radiation exists. Electromagnetic radiation exists because radiative energy exists. Radiative energy exists because quantum fields exist. Quantum fields exist because energy in general exists. And now we've reached a very fundamental nodal point, mass energy, which is a repository for everything above it. But mass energy itself is still a conditioned reality because it depends on something more fundamental than itself for its existence, namely the mass-energy space-time manifold. And that in turn depends on the existence of strings of energy vibrating in 10 dimensions. That is, assuming M theory is correct. And after this we have a glaring question mark. Now, the mass-energy tree is just an example. All reality in the universe is a conditioned reality, whether material, informational, abstract, or cognitive. Cognition, for instance, is accessed through the human brain, which is conditioned by spatial and temporal boundaries. In other words, the brain exists for a finite amount of time and occupies a finite amount of space. So let's look at a simple symbolic analogy. Conditioned reality 1 depends on a more fundamental condition, conditioned reality 2, which depends on conditioned reality 3 for its existence, and we can go all the way down to conditioned reality infinity, but that in turn is still a conditioned reality because it depends on something more fundamental, conditioned reality infinity plus 1 for its existence. And this series goes on ad infinitum, and we can put it into a circular argument. Many people like to argue philosophy in circular arguments, much like the dog that swallows himself, beginning with his tail and ends up disappearing into nothing. But no matter how we look at this, and no matter how complex the interdependencies are, we always end up with the same problem. There is a conditioned reality or a group of conditioned realities whose conditions for existence remain unfulfilled. Now, a group of conditioned realities is itself a conditioned reality, because within that group there is no unconditioned reality to fulfill the conditions for existence. So to make things more interesting, let's look at groups. Groups I, J, and K of conditioned realities. And we'll put between these groups any type of interdependency to satisfy any type of philosophy that exists, whether relativism, whether trans-dimensional, trans-temporal. But this is such a fundamental argument that at the end we're still faced with the same problem. There is a conditioned reality or a group of conditioned realities whose conditions for existence remain unfulfilled. So we're left with two possibilities. 1, conditioned realities go on infinitely, or 2, there exists an unconditioned reality. But past time is finite, because it's impossible to pass through an infinite medium. Looking forward in this example, Johnny be God, make me a universe. It'll take an infinite time though. And quite reasonably he responds, I can't. There's always infinitely more left to do. Okay, looking backward, Johnny be fooled. The universe has been here for an infinite time. Do I look like a mug? That's the same problem seen backwards. The Borde-Vilenkin-Guth theorem. Any universe or multiverse with a Hubble constant greater than 0, which is the case, must have a beginning. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide beyond the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning, quote unquote, Alexander Vilenkin. So the first conclusion, there is an unconditioned reality. This must be so. It is unique, since more than one implies difference, and that is a restrictive condition. Now the next point is intelligibility. Intelligibility is that which can be comprehended. It implies information content to a certain extent. Intelligibility answers the questions of what, why, and how. Back to the tree of reality example. Each level of conditioned reality has an associated restricted intelligibility. We'll look at iron again as an example. What is the intelligibility of iron? What is it? It's a hard, opaque, conductive substance. Why? Because it's a dense crystalline structure with free charge carriers. What's a crystal? Atoms bonded in a periodic structure. What are atoms? Protons, neutrons, and electrons. What are protons and neutrons? Subatomic particles composed of quarks and gluons. But still more intelligibility is required. We have questions that are unanswered. What are subatomic particles? Constituents of all matter and force carriers. What is matter? The stuff of the universe which is constant with mass energy and occupies the space-time manifold. Still more questions remain unanswered though. More intelligibility is required. What is mass energy? Vibrating strings of energy in 10 dimensions, assuming M theory is correct. But what are strings? Why do they exist? Again, we're back to the glaring question mark. So at each level of conditioned reality, a more fundamental intelligibility is needed. Each level of reality has restricted intelligibility, as we said, since it leaves a coherent question unanswered. But an answer to every coherent question must exist, even if we cannot comprehend it, since the answer is either X or everything that is not X. Now in the diagram, in the circle, we have an answer X. And outside the circle in that infinite plane is every other answer that is not X. And together they form the sum total of all possible answers. And the alternative is nothing. And this is absurd, that the answer to a coherent question could possibly be nothing. So in each case the answer lies in a more fundamental intelligibility. Hence the question, for instance, why do we exist, must have an answer. So we're left with two possibilities. One, restricted intelligibility goes on infinitely with an infinity of questions and answers, since each question must have an answer. Or two, there exists an unrestricted intelligibility. But infinite progression has already been ruled out. Therefore, unrestricted intelligibility must exist. And there can be only one unrestricted intelligibility, since more than one implies difference, which is a restriction. Now, unrestricted intelligibility is also unconditioned reality, since if unconditioned reality has restricted intelligibility, it is conditioned, and that is a contradiction. Now, the second conclusion, unconditioned reality is also unrestricted intelligibility. The next point is understanding. Since intelligibility is that which can be comprehended, understanding is directly related to intelligibility. Understanding begins in an empirical environment. Empirical means it can be observed and experimented upon. And a good example of this is a child, as he learns in his immediate environment by interacting with those things that are around him. So staying with this theme, we look at the example of a child's pegboard. The pegboard has intelligible content. It has shape, color, and position. Understanding develops as intelligible content is placed in relation to other intelligible content. It progresses as relationships between relationships of intelligible content, and an idea of the solution to the puzzle is formed in this empirical framework. So we look at a diagram to explain this. The child first grasps relationship between color, say. He then understands relationship between shapes, and then relationship between position. but then he must put it all together in relationship between relationships of this intelligibility before a solution to the pegboard is arrived at. And now we come to abstract understanding. So far we have been discussing understanding restricted to an empirical environment, but the understanding we are concerned about is that of a conscious being with self-awareness. It goes beyond the mere solution to a pegboard. A monkey can be trained to solve a pegboard as a trick. A computer can be programmed to solve it given certain boundaries. But true understanding can take intelligibility across the restriction of empirical boundaries and into the abstract. This occurs when intelligible content exists as an idea outside an empirical framework. The intelligibility of numbers in a multiple pegboard is a good way of explaining this. The intelligibility of numbers is learned initially in an empirical framework as the child plays with multiple copies of what's around him. It then moves from the empirical to the abstract as the child understands numbers for their own sake. 5 pegs now becomes just 5. This abstract understanding can then be applied to more situations, such as 5 apples, 5 pens, or 5 of anything. We see it as much less restricted. The understanding of more than and less than develops, followed by basic arithmetic. When higher mathematics is grasped, it is a purer abstract understanding. Removed from a specific empirical framework, it can be applied across an immense spectrum of understanding. And this is clearly seen from the numerous branches of science that require mathematics as their language. Also, in the theme of the pegboard, shapes can be understood abstractly, as in Johnny is a well-rounded person, or Jack was thinking in circular arguments. So ideas detached from an empirical framework are less restricted forms of understanding. They encompass a much broader scope of application. Only an active understanding can take intelligible content from the empirical to the abstract. The less restricted the intelligibility, the less restricted the active understanding. Hence, unrestricted intelligibility is an act of unrestricted and perfect understanding. So our third conclusion, unrestricted intelligibility is an act of unrestricted and perfect understanding, as we have said. And our final conclusion, since understanding exists only in a conscious, intelligent being, there exists a being who is unconditioned reality, unrestricted intelligibility, unrestricted and perfect understanding. There can be only one such being. This being is God. He is not his own cause, but exists through himself. Now, creation. The entirety of conditioned reality, restricted intelligibility, and restricted understanding is called creation. Since creation includes everything but God, it has no restricted intelligibility outside of itself to answer the questions why and how it comes to be. It must therefore subsist in unrestrictedness. Creation is therefore an idea in the mind of God, which continues to hold everything in existence, including you. Now, a very important point. Creation as an idea in the mind of God does not add nor take anything from God ontologically, that is, in terms of his being. An imperfect but good analogy of this is that ideas that I have do not add anything to my being, because if they did, I would be very careful never to think about snakes, lizards, or cockroaches. So an end note. God cannot be fully comprehended by human intellect, since our brains are conditioned realities in space and time. There is an unconditional way by which he may be known, unconditional love. Read The Death of Maximilian Kolbe at this web address for an example of this. You may be surprised. And he who alone knows himself is the only one who can reveal himself to humanity. Has he done so? By entering into human history? That's your quest. Goodbye, and may God bless you.